Events and callbacks. A great name because I couldn't figure out a way to define events that wasn't recursive, but events are things that happen that affect the user interface in some way. It could be that the user has interacted with a page element. You have to respond to that. You might have set a timer on an interaction with the user, and if the timer expires, the expiration of the timer is also an event. And most importantly for our discussion is when we start working with AJAX, we'll see that an AJAX call consists of really a split transaction. It's two halves. You send a transaction to the server, and then after a while, the server sends something back. The active data arriving is also an event that we can handle. Events are usually, but not always, associated with some element in the DOM. We talked about the DOM last time. It's a data structure representing the representation of a page, the document that you're viewing. So for example, if the user interacts with a specific item on the page, those kinds of events are essentially tied to that DOM element. We say that the DOM element received the event. In other cases, like a timer expiring, the expiration of the timer may not necessarily be associated with any specific element. So the idea with elements, with the events that are associated with elements, is that we can bind a JavaScript function that we write. It's often called a handler, an event handler, to bind to a particular event type on a particular element. So clicking on a button or hovering over a particular region of the screen would be examples of events defined on elements, and we can write JavaScript code that gets control when those things happen. So here's kind of the general game plan for manipulating the DOM with events. First of all, you identify the elements that you will want to do stuff to in response to the events and make sure that they're conveniently selectable. So we talked last time about how one of the nice jQuery powers that you get is this polymorphic operator, $, which you can pass any CSS selector to and get back the elements matching that selector. So if you know which elements you're going to want to operate on, make sure that they're easily selectable with IDs or classes, and the elements that are going to trigger the interactions, likewise, make sure you can identify them. Write the handler functions that will cause the desired stuff to happen, and we're going to see some examples of that right now. And this is an important part for graceful degradation. In a setup function, you bind your handlers. Now, we talked briefly about the idea that since some browsers, believe it or not, don't use JavaScript or have it disabled for security reasons or are incompatibly implemented, you'd like the site to be usable on sites that have JavaScript disabled. So one of the tricks we said we were going to do is when we're setting up interactions that rely on JavaScript, we will set up those interactions in a JavaScript setup function. And the idea is that the setup function can only be called successfully if JavaScript is working. So in the event that JavaScript is not working, we won't try to do those things. Now, because you all are so astute and you're all into TDD because I've hopefully made you drink the Kool-Aid, you probably should realize that I forgot a step, which is write failing tests for the handler using TDD and then backfill the handler. So in fact, we're going to do that. We're just not going to cover it in that order. But in real life, there would be a step 2.5, and I'd encourage you to do that first. So let's do a simple example here. Here, truly, is the simplest JavaScript example I could think of. All it does is have a checkbox with show details. And yeah, I know, super, super impressive. But it's a good start. And it also gives me an opportunity to point out some bad JavaScript habits that I want you never to do. The first of which is putting the script right in the page. We already talked about the fact that instead of script and putting it in place, you can use script source and load it from somewhere else. In fact, Rails gives you the ability to just put your stuff into JavaScript files in the public JavaScript directory. But for our simple example, I just put some code directly in here so that you can see how it works. Notice one of the things we said we were going to do when we talked about JavaScript and global variables is we're going to define a single global variable. I called it hide test in this example, that contains all of our JavaScript stuff. So we only have one variable name polluting the global namespace. And I've got two functions in here, right? And by the way, what kind of a thing is hide test? It's a JavaScript object, which remember is basically just a hash. So we've got two properties. Both are function valued. We've got the actual function that handles the hiding and showing. And we've got a setup function. So what happens in the hiding and showing function? This is the function that gets triggered when I click on the checkbox. And here's a classic use of jQuery, right? The value of this inside a function handler, when you bind a JavaScript function on a DOM element, is the element that is handling the function. So inside this function, this is going to be bound to the browser's DOM representation of whichever element is handling this user event. And as we said last time, when we wrap an element in the $parentheses to call the jQuery function on it, we give the element the secret jQuery powers. One of the nice secret jQuery powers is a function called is, and you can pass a variety of properties to is to ask questions about the state of the element. Now, you might notice that this looks like a Ruby symbol with the colon in front of it. JavaScript doesn't have symbols, But I guess they thought the Ruby symbol thing was such a nice idea to connote the value of an enumerable type with a fixed number of values that they sort of adopted it in jQuery. So checked is just a plain old string, but it is one of a fixed set of string values that you can pass to is. So what's going on here? If the checkbox has been checked, then I identify the element, right? And if you scroll down to the content, here's my really simple, I got a checkbox and I gave it its own ID. And I have the paragraph that gets hidden and shown. I gave it its own ID. So if the checkbox is checked, I wrap the paragraph element with secret jQuery powers, and I call the slide down function, which we demonstrated last time. Conversely, if it's not checked, it must be unchecked, so I do the opposite thing. And what happens in the setup function? Well, the setup function has to actually connect the JavaScript code to the event and the element that we want to trigger it on. So what am I binding on? I'm taking the element whose ID is check, that's this checkbox down here, wrapping it to give it the secret jQuery powers, and calling change, which means when a change event is triggered on this element, call this. That's it, right? The syntax is pretty straightforward. Change is what we call a pseudo event. Some events really correspond directly to, physically the user pressed the mouse button or physically the user released the mouse button. Change is a logical event that means did the state of this control change? So for a checkbox, when it changes from either checked to unchecked or vice versa, either one of those would trigger the change handler, which makes it really useful for examples like this. OK, so that's a really simple example of how this might work. There's a lot of different event handlers, and there's both, as I said, there's sort of event handlers that are low level corresponding to user actions. There's logical event handlers, and there's also some pseudo handlers added by jQuery itself as an additional convenience. This is one of several good summaries you can look to see what all the different handlers are. And a question that arises is, what about events or elements that already sort of have built-in handlers? For example, it's already the case that when you click on a link, you expect the link to take you somewhere. So what happens if you try to bind a click behavior of your own to override that? And the simple answer is, if you have declared a handler for it, then yours gets to go first. If your handler returns false, then it suppresses any other default thing that would have happened. In fact, it suppresses any further event handlers from running. Otherwise, if there's other actions that would have happened anyway, they will follow after your handler has had a chance to run. So if you visited any of those annoying sites where you're clicking on links and either a random window pops up, or they don't take you to the website you thought, or you can't sort of right-click to download, that's what's going on, right? They've actually explicitly bound other handlers that essentially shadow what the web browser's built-in behavior would have been. A pretty standard and non-evil use of this technology is client-side form validation. So a common idiom that you'll see is when you have a form with a submit button, there'll be a submit handler bound to the form that does some sanity checks, like did you leave any fields blank that aren't supposed to be blank? If everything looks kosher, the handler returns true, thereby allowing the submit action to continue, sending the form to the server. But if something doesn't look good, the handler can return false, maybe put up a little message saying you forgot to fill in your credit card information so I can steal it, and then that would suppress the normal behavior of the form going to the server. So to summarize what we've seen, the kind of big ingredients in the game plan here is that you can select elements by having a CSS selector. And if you've done your homework, you made the element nicely selectable in your layouts. You wrap it to give it the secret jQuery powers, which we can no longer live without. You can inspect the element. You can look at its textual content. You can look at its raw HTML. You can ask questions about its state, like whether it's checked or selected. You can look at arbitrary attributes of the element. So these are all things that you can do in your handler. One thing we didn't show an example of, but is sort of the best practice for how you change the way that things look, changing the appearance of elements, is you define different CSS classes in your style sheet that correspond to the different possible appearances of the element. Or maybe one of the appearances is that the element is not shown at all. It's a CSS style that is hidden or that has a 0 height. And then what you can do is use the jQuery powers to add or remove classes to the elements. That causes the elements to change how they get displayed. And finally, you have a setup function that binds the handlers on the elements. One thing that I think I forgot to mention is making sure that the setup function gets called. So let me take a brief detour to make sure that we see the example of how to do that. So I declared my single global variable. I have my 2 JavaScript functions inside it, one of which is my setup function. And here's the last thing. This is outside the scope of any function, so this JavaScript is going to execute as soon as the page starts getting loaded. And what's actually happening is, here's another way. Remember I said there's 4 ways to call this $paren function. Here's a third way that we haven't seen yet, which is you pass it a function object that is going to get called when the page is ready. Notice that it's not called immediately. The reason it's not called until the page is ready is that for historical reasons, JavaScript code on a page is actually allowed to begin executing before the page has been fully loaded. So a pitfall that might happen is our setup function might be making references to certain elements on the page, and if the page hasn't been fully loaded, those elements might not exist yet. So what actually happens in jQuery is it will put this function on the list of functions to call when the page is actually ready. So when you use this, you can be sure that by the time your setup function is called, all of the elements that you expect to be on the page are actually there. OK. So with that in mind, here's an example use case. We have a form, and we've declared an onSubmit handler. Now, this is sort of an older way that used to be much more common for how you would bind handlers, is that there are certain handlers that can be bound directly as HTML element attributes. In general, this is no longer considered a best practice. It's better to just have that single setup function that does all the binding explicitly. But for now, let's use this as an example. We've got a form, and we've got a text box, and we've got a submit button. And if you load this form into a browser that doesn't have JavaScript enabled for whatever reason, what's going to happen? Will the browser complain because the HTML is malformed? Will the browser complain, but only when you try to submit the form because you have this onSubmit handler? Or the form actually will be submitted, but the inputs won't be checked, so whatever this function was intended to do just won't get done, or nothing will happen. You'll click the submit button, and it'll just sit there, and the server will not get the form. So which of these four things will happen in a non-JavaScript-aware legacy browser?